We should not be in beanie season anymore, yet we are.
You are.
I am still in beanie season, which means I've been delaying getting a haircut for like probably a month or more. And we're now well into the mid 80s. So I should not be wearing a beanie anymore, but it's either that or make time for a haircut. And so I'm defaulting to beanie.
I was going to brag about how we had 85-degree weather yesterday and it was amazing. But apparently you also have 85-degree weather on the East Coast. So
it's muggy as hell. But these are the sacrifices that we make for you, our audience, that we are so grateful for. So thank you for joining us today in prolonged beanie season. And we've got a fun episode today.
Yeah. Singular put out their most recent quarterly marketing trends report. A very interesting piece of content. Kudos to the team over at Singular who've put this out. There's a lot in here, and we thought we'd just run through it, pull out the highlights, give a little bit of additional analysis, what we think about it. I also pulled some of our metrics to compare to their metrics.
I think this will be a good one. As always, the podcast was brought to you by our team here at Upptic. Here at Upptic, we do all things to scale games and help them grow. We build software for that. We build creative. We run UA campaigns. We do Web3 native marketing, all sorts of fun stuff. So if you're growing a great game and need some help with that, you can reach us through our website. It's upptic.com. That's upptic.com.
Awesome. Let's dive right in. I'm going to give you everything that we're going to cover in 45 seconds. 45
Great.
seconds.
I'm going to take a nap.
I just want to call it sort of the TLDR from the Singular report. And their number one overarching macro theme was that mobile phone penetration continues to grow at staggering rates. And we'll talk a little bit about how large that actually is. ATT opt-in rates are increasingly diverging between gaming and non-gaming, with gaming opt-in rates actually increasing, which is pretty interesting. And it's something that we've seen in our data as well. In terms of the kings of global advertising on mobile, no surprises here. Google, TikTok, and Meta are the undisputed kings. For the longest time it was Meta and Google, and now there's a number 3 who's undisputed with the other two. CPIs, interestingly, are diverging as well. CPIs on iOS are going up. Costs are going up globally, while Androids are decreasing. And iOS is gaining market share dollars compared to Android. So,
yeah, and I want to add here, I thought this was a really good report because there's a lot of things that kind of like we were feeling. Here at Upptic, we operate on give or take maybe around 20 games or so concurrently. And there's definitely trends that we were seeing around opt-in rates, around CPI trends, around performance, where we're shifting budget between iOS and Android, kind of emerging, what's going on with desktop and PC marketing. And I always love confirmation bias, but yeah, definitely a lot of the things that we were seeing in the trenches seem to be mirrored at a macro level. As Xander mentioned, as we go through this report, we'll also add some color from what we've been seeing day to day in our work here at Upptic.
Awesome. I will show you the actual report. Cool. So, mobile at a glance. There are a few highlights here. So number one, there are nearly 7 billion smartphones globally. I assumed there was a lot of smartphones, but this is even more than I assumed there were, with including 1.1 billion being added last year. Warren, there are almost as many smartphones as humans, and they will eclipse us very, very soon. In terms of what is interesting about how the growth is affecting economics, we got 135 billion in annual IPs last year, with 446 billion in mobile ad spend and 2.2 trillion in e-commerce spending. So it's a big market, it turns out.
Yeah, and one thing that's top of mind too is that we're now bringing internet thanks to services like Starlink. There's a lot of markets that are starting to get internet that have never had it before. And so we're seeing this like close to 1-to-1. I think we're going to probably in the very near term future see the amount of phones, active phones, outnumber humans. And I think we'll probably see that probably within the next 5 years if I had to place bets.
I mean, at this growth rate, if we're adding 1.1 billion last year and we're almost at 7 billion, could be this year. Yeah, coming up quick. Cool. So getting into something sort of more tangible, and this is something that we've tracked very closely, and this is maybe one of the most important metrics for mobile marketing executives and marketers in general to track, and then 2, to have a plan for. So overall, ATT opt-in rates. So if you're advertising on iOS, an ATT opt-in allows you to track a user, which if you're doing any sort of performance marketing is the single most critical thing you can do. And the overall ATT opt rate has dropped 16% quarter over quarter from Q4 of last year to Q1 of this year. Last quarter, it was nearly 19%. Well, this quarter, it's nearly 16%. So in aggregate, ATT opt-ins are going down. Now, that's not great. However, this is pretty interesting when we look at how they are diverging between gaming and non-gaming. So if you look at gaming specifically, we're actually seeing a different story, which is we see 19% opt-ins versus 15% on non-gaming. And that's a delta that's bifurcating. So we're seeing more gaming opt-ins versus a decrease in non-gaming opt-ins. And I wanted to just double check this. And so I pulled the data from some of our largest clients. And without going into details, this is a trend that we're seeing also, where we're seeing in Q4 of last year, a lower opt-in rate versus one of this year, we're seeing an increased opt-in rate for ATT users. So interesting insight. Warren, do you have any thoughts?
The first thing that jumped out was just like how spot on this was with what we see with our internal operations here, which is anyone who talks to me regularly. I talk all the time about how generally in gaming, we've been seeing about a 1 in 5 opt-in from iOS users to allow tracking. And that's almost spot on with this. I think it was like 19.5%. So let's zoom out, think about that very practically, for the state of people marketing on iOS today, and jumping ahead a little bit to the two largest channels, Meta and Google. These are channels where there's no fingerprinting. These are channels where at best, you're getting the opt-in of 1 out of 5 or like 19.5% of your users. So that means you have very thick fog of war in making performance marketing decisions. Obviously, to self-plug a little bit here, like on our engineering side, we've been devoting a ton of resources to working around this problem so we can continue to scale on iOS. But we, again, have kind of this limited purview of the apps and games, the slice that we're working on. So it's interesting to see that the same kind of limitations that we've been seeing are affecting the whole industry. And I would call out, like, for how massive of a problem this is, like, we're a relatively small team here. I'm still shocked at how little viable solutions there are in market for effectively working around this.
Yeah, totally agree. One of the interesting charts that I wanted to show is this double opt-in rate. And this is basically, in order to track users, you need to have ATT prompts from both the advertiser app as well as the installed app. And when you look at that, these opt-in rates, like, it drops off like pretty precipitously. And it's crazy to see how few users you can track as these rates start to drop off. It's really critical that we have tracking solutions. You can hit up Upptic. Let's go to the next trend. Here's another chart that I thought was pretty interesting. They broke us down by ATT opt-in by gaming vertical. What we see is that there's actually an incredible divergence by gaming vertical. So racing games, music game, adventure games, 20 plus to 30%. We're at the low end puzzle, hyper casual, trivia, casino, very, very low single digit opt-in rates, and down to educational, which is mostly targeted at children, which have 0% opt-in rates because you can't track children legally.
Right. Yeah, this is an interesting view. I mean, the thing that jumps out to make very broad stereotypes, which is always a good thing to do, right, is the right hand of the spectrum. Casino, trivia, family, puzzle. These are all genres that I'd say like expand more to a bit older demographic, non-gaming, outside of like the core stereotypical gaming demographic of younger male demo.
Right.
Whereas like on the other side of the spectrum, racing, music games, adventure games, card simulation, board games, role-playing games, strategy, these are all more what you'd call like the core typical gaming demographic. So it seems like there's a more general acceptance in frequent gamers to these prompts. It also might mean that like game developers are getting better at how they're positioning these prompts. I'm not sure what the cause is, but there's a very clear trend that core gamers are more likely to opt in than people that are occasional or self-identifying non-gamers that, the only games on their phone might be that trivia or slots app.
Right. Well, and this jumps ahead to some data that we'll show at the end, which was that basically 50% of game users look to advertising for their game discovery. And it's like, okay, if that's the case, if you're a core user and you identify with that 50%, then it makes sense that you'd want to be tracked because you understand that you're getting incrementally good games that you would play. And so I'm not sure that's 100% the cause, but it's an interesting hypothesis at least. We see a similar divergence on non-gaming. The only thing that I notice here is that it bifurcates even more intensely, with 37% for art and design at the top end and music and audio down less than 1%. And so just interesting to call out.
I'm going to assume it's like some weird outlier factor, like maybe a few apps skewing this. But one thing that really jumps out to me is music games have the highest opt-in, but music non-gaming apps have one of the lowest opt-ins.
Yeah.
Well, I guess it's a very different profile, like those that play games like Guitar Hero or something like that versus like those that are doing like music production and things like that.
This could also just be a function of like Singular's data set.
Right.
How many music apps there are? It's like Spotify, Apple Music. What else? Let's jump ahead. So the next major bucket was CPI trends. And this is pretty interesting overall. So what we saw was that in aggregate, for Android games, CPIs have increased 12 cents on average quarter over quarter to 73 cents. And that it is pretty starkly distributed across game genres. So it's another case where games are not the same across the board. And if you look at Casino here is really, really crazy comparative to everything. Casino for Android, over $5 per install. We're at the low end, something like hyper casual trivia, we're in single digit cents for some of these categories. So I don't think this is surprising to anyone who sort of is a really robust performance marketer. We understand that LTVs for casino games and more core games in general have much higher LTVs, which allow you to pay a lot more per user. Casino being the ridiculous outlier on one end. Is this at all surprising to you, Warren, or is there anything?
Once again, this kind of mirrors what we've seen internally. We just did a big audit for one of the projects we're working on of just looking at year over year trends. And we actually drove in super granularly. We looked at not just the same targeting, but literally the same keywords, like Q1 2024 versus Q1 2023. And we saw trends that mirrored this, or I'd say in some cases were even more exaggerated. I mean, it's roughly a 16, 17% increase year over year in this trend. I think that's aggregated across all channels. In some of the higher performing channels like Apple Search, we're seeing this trend even more magnified. And if you think about it, that makes sense. So as CPIs go up and marketing gets less efficient, there's going to be a concentration of well, crap, we can't do this channel anymore. We can't do this channel anymore. You kind of get priced out of certain channels that aren't hitting your ROI requirements. Right. And Apple Search is traditionally one of the highest ROI but least scalable channels. Caveats that a lot of that ROI is just stealing your organic users, but I'll save that rant for somewhere else. From just a metric standpoint, Apple Search usually has some of the strongest ROI. So it makes sense that some of these last standing channels that have the highest ROI are even more impacted, because as you're losing arms that you can deploy your marketing capital effectively, you're concentrating those, as all your competition is, on the remaining highest performing channels. So yeah, that's all to say, yes, macro, we've seen the same kind of CPI trends, but for the best performing channels, the trend has been even more exacerbated.
Yeah, and then I think the other interesting thing to look at here is that in non-gaming, you actually see the opposite trend. So we're seeing a decrease in cost per install. Now, we looked at a trend recently, a data AI trend, which shows the growth in non-gaming apps overall. So this could just be the extension of the non-gaming segment. It also can be that gaming is a very, very high LTV segment in general relative to other segments. But just interesting to see that trend that we saw on Android where CPI is going up does not hold the same on not gaming.
Yeah, this trend really doesn't make any sense to me. The only explanation I can make for such a drastic downward shift like that is potentially a large move into more international spending, because Android historically has a much stronger international footprint outside of the US, and also has more disparate CPIs once you go outside of kind of your tier one markets. Or let me put that another way. We see usually that iOS CPIs are more boxed because iOS devices have a high floor of entry, whereas especially outside of the US, Android devices are really low cost, especially in emerging countries.
Yeah.
So to see the bottom fall out of global Android CPI, I kind of want to know what else is going on under the hood here. The only reason I can come up with is if the spend really changed in markets.
I think one other thing is the seasonality in this, right? So this is comparing Q4 of last year versus Q1 of this year. We know that people really aggressively spend in Q4 generally. And so it could be, a really big push, especially for retail and commerce apps, which are big non-gaming apps, that there's a big push in the end of last year to get, Christmas boom, and then it's Q1, and so people are pulling back. And the strength that we're seeing in non-gaming is just a testament to the strength of the gaming segment overall. And on iOS, we see basically the same trend. It's just much more exacerbated, right? And so for global CPIs, we have a 50-cent increase for Q1 of this year versus Q4 of last year to $2.74 average CPI. And I think the interesting difference here, casino is still the overall winner, but the breadth of it being an outlier is much lower, right? And so it is the most expensive, $7.50 per install, but the delta between that and the card genre, board game genre, and all these other genres is much lower than the corresponding delta on the Android side, which is, I think, just an interesting trend to see overall. Because I guess a high value Android user who plays casino is worth a lot versus there's a lot of high value iOS users across genres.
Yeah, so we see even a more drastic change when we drill into iOS specifically. We just covered how Android had in aggregate gone down a bit, but quite the opposite. I mean, this is nearly a 20% increase on iOS CPIs quarter over quarter. which reflects definitely the macro that we're seeing.
Cool. Next up, we will jump forward and talk about network trends overall. And so this is something that I think they've gotten very good at obfuscating what the network data shows. I think that's because they have a bunch of partners they don't want to piss off. But how they're describing this is they don't quantify this anyway, but these are the advertisers that are gaining the net number of new logos. So Meta, Google, TikTok, number 1, 2, and 3. No surprise there. Apple Search, you just talked about how they're gaining market share. Interestingly, to me at least, Snap and X, which you've talked a lot about recently, how it's that an X has been relative to what our expectations have been historically. And then Iron Source, notably missing Unity from this chart at all. Thoughts, Warren?
Yeah, I think once again, in theme, like what we're seeing in the trenches kind of reflected in the macro here. So yeah, we've reactivated on X and seen decent performance there for a few of the products that we support. We've definitely doubled down on the ad networks where we've seen historical strength. We're doing a lot less weirdo experimentation with new ad networks. And a big part of that is because there's less that exist, less new ones coming to market. Props to Singular. Every MMP does some sort of annual list, power rankings of ad networks. And usually there's at least one or two that are like embarrassing that they're on the list for anyone who actually does UA, because you know that like there are high amounts of fraud or other questionable things going on with them. It's a clean list. Like I think just about everyone on this list I could recommend and say, you know, we do business with or have at least explored. So yeah, props to Singular on that front.
What is Line Ads?
Oh, Line is huge in Asia. It's
show my ignorance. Great.
Yeah, it's a major like communication app in Asian markets.
Cool. This is a different way of saying the same thing. This is the same sort of power rank metrics, but by overall ad spend. And so notably, Google, Meta, TikTok, their places are slightly rearranged, unsurprisingly at the top. AppLovin, number 4. If you listened to our episode last week about AppLovin's earnings report, you know, this is unsurprising given how ascendant AppLovin has been in the recent months. Apple Search gaining market share, Iron Source here as well, Unity on this list, which, you know, reasonable. And then Twitter, less impactful than the new logos, but 9 overall compared to who they're competing with here, above Amazon, above Verizon. I mean, it's not anything to sneeze at. And then what I did in the background is I went and I pulled our metrics, Warren. So I won't read them out one for one. But what I did want to do is just sort of compare and contrast what we're seeing versus what they're seeing. And so, do you want to guess what our top 3 are?
Sure. All right, let me guess. I'm going to guess Google number 1, TikTok number 2, and I'm going to be Swiss and say a rewarded video network number 3.
Close.
That I don't. Yeah, go ahead.
Meta number 3.
Meta number 3. Okay.
Yeah. So
Meta has been like blocked on, I think, half of the products that we work on with like the worst customer support.
Well, I mean, and that's pretty interesting to show how they're still falling in here. Although now that I look at this, down quarter over quarter, marginally. Interesting that also Unity and Iron Source, some of our top performing networks historically, they have flipped where previously Unity was above Iron Source, now Iron Source above Unity. And then I think this is the interesting call that we have seen that's different than what's in this report. We've seen Mintegral being marginally ascendant, which is interesting, and AppLovin is falling out of our portfolio. Now, I don't think this is representative necessarily of the overall market trend. This has to do more with specifics around what platforms work for our advertisers. And specifically, one of the things we talked about a lot in the past is that the mediation platform that you use to serve your rewarded video really, really has a huge impact on the efficacy of that UA. So if you use Max Ads, AppLovin historically does very, very well. And conversely, if you use Level Play, Iron Source does very well. And so part of, I think, where we're seeing certain channels outperform is that dynamic playing out.
Yeah, and just to spell that out a little bit more, this is because in the kind of current leading optimization strategies, there's a level of granularity for ad revenue that you get when you are using a given mediation provider within the corresponding ad network that you don't get in other ad networks. So you have like a leg up for that native network that you're also doing mediation through, be it AppLovin and Max or Iron Source and Level Play.
Yeah, cool. So we'll jump ahead. This one I don't think is super, super unexpected, which it's just to say that we've seen ad spend growth in top tier countries. That's pretty unsurprising. But United States, UK, Canada, Germany, basically all the tier ones, and then some Brazil, Taiwan, Indonesia. This is an unsurprising chart to me. People are advertising to where there's money.
Yeah, I think it's just sort of the law. If you're just looking at the amount of increase, I'd be curious if they broke this down by a percentage.
They don't.
Increase.
What they did say is that there's a 41% intra-quarter spend growth. And so in January, people cut off all their spending from Christmas, and over the course of the quarter, spending ramps back up. And so I think that's what this dynamic shows. Cool. Let's jump ahead to ad spend by platform. This, I think, is an interesting overall view, which is to show where ad spend dollars are going across their entire data set. So in aggregate, iOS is 40%, Android is 37%, and 23% is web. And so what does this mean? This is a singular data set specifically, and I think there is a certain amount of data bias in here. So we know that most of this is mobile, but they do have some desktop, which they are bucketing under web here. This split it's basically 50-50. I mean, is there anything surprising to you about this, Warren?
Yeah, I mean, this is another trend we've talked about over time. We had like the adpocalypse where everyone just panicked and didn't know how to measure on iOS and defaulted to just moving a ton of their ad spend to Android. And in the first, I'd say, 2 years following the implementation of Scan and ATT on iOS, we saw this huge shift to Android spend. Gradually, iOS has been inching back, and now we're basically almost back to where we were pre-ATT. I would say Android has, if I had to guess, even though it's now a small minority, it's a small deficit compared to iOS. I think if I go back to like 2016 years and prior, even a heavier bias to iOS was what I saw in most organizations that I was part of. Mm-hmm. But what we've seen here is like at a certain point, companies are figuring out one way or another to participate in iOS again. Right. What I see in the trenches is very remedial approaches of like, well, we know we need to invest in iOS again. We're just going to kind of look at blended metrics. We're going to use fingerprinting where fingerprinting works. But people have kind of duct taped together ways to participate in the iOS ecosystem again, as they should be. There was these years where it was just like super easy for teams like us that had figured out workarounds for ATT to just, all right, cool, no one else is going to buy an iOS. Like, we'll go ahead and do it while it's cheap. But now we're definitely back to more a return of normalcy, at least from a spend standpoint.
And Warren, would you be happy to know that the data articulates exactly what you just described? So if you look at the trend from Q4 of last year to Q1 of this year, we're seeing a 3% overall increase in iOS with a 4.5% decrease in iOS, and web is basically flat. And so the data from the singular report just re-articulates exactly the thing that you described, which is people are increasingly realizing they have to go after the most valuable billion users in the world, and they're going, spending on iOS. Cool. A lot more interesting stuff in here. We will link to it in the description, and you should take a look. There's a lot more that we didn't cover. There is one last view that Warren called out that's pretty interesting. They have a partner section at the end, which I really liked. And there's a view that Misplay put together for them. And so, Warren, do you want to talk a little bit about the Misplay view that you found?
Yeah, I thought this was a novel data set and a good one to throw in here, contributed by Misplay. So the view that we're showing is basically for spenders, how are they discovering games? This is a very important objective because there is a very tiny minority within mobile gaming especially, but really in any free-to-play economy that carries the brunt of revenue for the rest. So it's super important to have strategies that let you find that needle in the haystack. I was just talking to a top 3 mobile developer yesterday that we work with, and the product lead was basically saying how 5% payer rate is crazy in their genre, which I would attest to. So you're kind of fist pumping if you have 3% of your player base spending money. So it's really important to figure out how to find that percentage. So yeah, what the data is basically showing for those listening in is that high value spenders, mobile game ads is still the largest discovery, but they under index. So they're less likely to install through an ad than an average spender, and also less likely to install through chart position through top free games than an average spender. But where they over index is recommendations, social media specifically. So sort of trusted sources, it seems like are more important to high spenders or whales in game.
Yeah.
There was a follow-up data set, if you want to scroll down just a little bit further, Xander, about how spenders react to ads. So this chart we're showing is what spenders do when experiencing an ad in the game they're playing. And there's just some data on here. I'm not going to walk through each view, but it basically just shows that the bulk of high-value spenders typically ignore and disengage with all advertisements, or they will pay attention if it's similar to a game they're already playing. So the data is interesting, but what I thought was more interesting was this analysis. So I'm going to read a quick quote. with the leading reason for spenders to click on an ad and install a game being that the gameplay in the ad looks like something that they'd enjoy, followed by eye-catching visuals. Publishers need to ensure creative is accurate and tailored to spenders' underlying motivations and gaming preferences. Though many spenders report being frustrated by misaligned gameplay, so the need for true gameplay footage in advertising can't be overlooked. All right, so what is this saying? We all know the trend and the stereotype of like the misleading, over-the-top, gross-out mobile game ads. This report and analysis basically mirrors what we found here at Upptic and why we don't do this process generally. We see that, yes, you can do ads like this that are super clickbaity and get people to click and install, but they ultimately don't drive revenue. If you want to drive revenue, it might sound boring, but like a great way to do that is just say like, here's the game that you're going to play. Doesn't it look fun? And for those that are, call it your more educated or more tuned in gamers that are more likely to be your high value spenders, they care about understanding what the game experience is actually going to be. So again, we love things that confirm our bias here. Not that we're above good clickbait. We do love clickbait, but my high level takeaway here is like people stop copying other companies that are doing the misleading gameplay ads. Gamers hate them, but more importantly, they're not going to make you money. They're not going to be as profitable for you as maybe a slightly lower converting, but more honest gameplay featuring ad. And that's what this analysis seems to reinforce.
Yeah. Awesome. Super interesting. Cool. Well, that's it. There's a lot more in the overall report, so we'll link to it. Thanks for sticking with us. Warren, take us out.
All right. Thanks, everyone, for sticking with us for this data deep dive episode. And thank you to Singular for providing a strong report that gave us something meaty to dig into this week. As always, the pod is brought to you by our team here at Upptic. At Upptic, we do all things to help games grow. We love games. We live and breathe them. We are your allies for scaling your games profitably in whatever tactics are needed for that. You can reach us through our website. That's upptic.com, upptic.com.
Talk soon.